Maseches Yevamos Daf Ayin Gimel discusses the question of what is the halacha about Meiser Sheni for an Arel. Someone without a bris milah allowed to eat Meiser Sheni. The Gemara will explain the question. The Gemara will attempt to derive an answer from a brisa. The Gemara will reject it, and the Gemara will need to save that rejection with two ways of explaining it. The Gemara will launch, therefore, into a lengthy discussion of a brisa that compares the three items, Meiser Sheni, Bikurim, and Truma, and where they differentiate in their halachos and the sources of those halachos. That'll be the primary focus of the daf as a sidestep to this question of what's the halacha about an orel on Meiser Sheni. So the Gemara begins that this question was asked to Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes was asked, what is the halachic status of an orel? Someone without a bris milah, is he allowed to eat Meiser Sheni? The Gemara explains the question. We have a connection between Meiser Sheni and Korban Pesach in the context of an onain. An onain, somebody who is in mourning but hasn't begun his actual avelos yet. The relative he has lost has not yet received kfura. The burial hasn't happened yet. So we learn from Meiser Sheni to Pesach that he cannot eat from the Korban Pesach. It says so explicitly by Meiser. You say, Lo achalti ba'oni mimenu. A lot of the halachos in Meiser Sheni are learned out of vidui Meiser. So when one removes his final Meiser Sheni from his house, which has to happen every couple of years, he has to say a parsha describing that he didn't do anything wrong. He kept all the halachos of Meiser correctly. And from there we learn a lot of the halachos. One of the things it says is that it didn't eat it as an onain. So you see that an onain is not allowed to eat Meiser Sheni. We have a link from there to Korban Pesach, that an onain is also not allowed to eat from a Korban Pesach. The question is, does that link go the other way? We know that an orel, someone doesn't have a bris milah, is not allowed to eat from Korban Pesach. Can we learn from there to Meiser that an orel is also not allowed to eat Meiser Sheni? So the Gemara says possibly you can learn it, after all the connections established between the two, or possibly not. Possibly we say, no, you only learn from Meiser Sheni, which is lighter than Korban Pesach. It's more lenient in its halachos, so you can learn any stringency, any isser that applies to Meiser Sheni applies to the stricter Korban Pesach as well. But to go the other way and say a stringency you find by Korban Pesach applies to Meiser Sheni, that you can't necessarily say. So the Gemara says that this question, as we said, was asked to Rav Sheshes, and he answered that it's an explicit brisa. There's a brisa that lists the differences between Truma and Bikurim versus Meiser, and it does not list that Truma and Bikurim, which are forbidden for an Arel to eat, it does not list that Meiser is different. Meiser, therefore, obviously has the same halacha, and it is also asur for an Arel to eat. Now, the Gemara is going to ask, just that maybe it's just left off the list. It's ton of a shear. We listed a lot of things. We didn't list everything. Maybe this is also a difference between Meiser versus Bikurim and Truma, but we just didn't mention because we didn't mention everything. The Gemara will then say, well, then you got to list other things. There has to be something else that's left off. You can't just leave off one thing. If it's a complete list, then it's a complete list. If it's an incomplete list, there's got to be more than one thing left off. You can't tell me this is the only thing that's left off, and the Gemara will attempt to find what else is left off. So let's go through the list that the brisa brings. How is Meiser different than Truma and Bikurim? So the list are as follows. For Truma and Bikurim, one who eats it who is not supposed to be eating them, it's that is Truma if it's eaten by a non-Kohen, or Bikurim if it's eaten outside Yerushalayim, so it's chayav misa b'dei shemayim. Meiser, that does not apply. Truma and Bikurim are asur for Zorim to eat. A non-Kohen is not allowed to eat Bikurim. A non-Kohen is not allowed to eat Truma. A non-Kohen is allowed to eat Meiser. Truma and Bikurim belong to the Kohen. They're not considered to be Mamon Gavoa. They're not considered to be a Nichse Gavoa. They belong to the individual. He's allowed to use it, for example, to do a Kiddushin. That's a leniency for Truma and Bikurim. Meiser, on the other hand, is considered to be a Mamon Gavoa. You have the right to eat it and to use it as oil to smear, but it doesn't belong to you. You cannot use it to be Mekadosh Anisha, for example. As far as if they fall into a mixture of chulin, so Truma and Bikurim are batel only b'meya, and 100 times as much as their volume. Meiser is batel b'shishim, like regular iser. One needs to wash his hands before touching Truma and Bikurim because they are considered to have kedusha, and a shnios, that is a sheni l'tumah, a second level tumah, will passel them, make them forbidden to be eaten. And hands are always considered midrabanan to be a sheni l'tumah. However, that does not apply to Meiser Sheni. A Tevul Yom is not allowed to eat Truma and Bikurim, but he is allowed to eat Meiser Sheni. And the one thing that's left off the list is an Arel. So you see that there is no difference as far as all is concerned. That just like Truma and Bikurim are forbidden to eat, are forbidden to be eaten by an Oral, Meiser is also forbidden to be eaten by an Oral. So the Gemara says, no, maybe it was left out. The Gemara says, what else was left off the list? So the Gemara says something was left off, not this list, but left off the second half of the Brisa, which lists the differences between Truma versus Bikurim and Meiser. Now, the Gemara at the end will give another thing that was left off these lists, another two items that were left off these lists, the first list. But now the Gemara is going to go to the second list in this Brisa. So let's see the second list. This is the list of how Truma is different than Bikurim and Meiser. So there are 6 ways here that are listed. Some of them have a machlokas. So Bikurim and Meiser have to be brought to Yerushalayim. Truma does not. Bikurim and Meiser come with a special vidui, a parsha that we say when we bring them. Truma doesn't. Bikurim and Meiser are aser for an onain. Well, Meiser is aser to an onain. That's mefurish in the pasuk. Bikurim is a machlokes. The Tanna Kama says it's aser to an onain. Rabbi Shimon says it's mutter to an onain. The Gemara will explain what the source of that is, why they're arguing over. However, Truma, everybody agrees, is mutter to an onain. As far as the halach of biur, that it must be removed from the house once every couple of years, that applies to Meiser for sure. Bikurim is again a machlokes, Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon. Tanna Kama says there is a chi of biur. Bikurim, Reb Shimon says there is not. But Truma, everybody agrees there is no inyan of biur Truma. Now, what happens if it becomes tamei? So you can't eat these things b'tumah. Can you burn them if they are tamei? Can you get rid of them for your own personal use if they are tamei? Can you use it as firewood, or if you have truma oil, could you use it to burn and get benefit from it? So Meiser is aser. That says explicitly. Bikurim is aser as well. However, Truma is mutter. The Gemara will explain where we get that halacha from. And the last thing on the list, if somebody eats them betuma, although it is aser, there's no malchus for Truma, but there is malchus for eating Bikurim and Meiser if they are tamei. That's not talking about if you're tamei, it's talking about if they are tamei. Now, those last 2 halachos were left off the list. The list only has the first 4 halachos. The halacha of burning it if it's aser and eating them tamei, those 2 are not on the list. So you see the Mishnah, the Brisa that is did leave things off the list, and therefore it also left off the list the halacha of an Arel by Meiser as opposed to Bikurim and Truma. Alright, now the Gemara goes into this Brisa more deeply, discussing the machlokes and the sources of the opinions and the sources of some of the other halachas. So the first thing that we have here is a machlokes. So what's the halacha about an onain? Is an onain allowed to eat Bikurim or not? It says a machlokes Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon. The Gemara says the source of the machlokes is a pasuk which ostensibly refers to Truma, but we know that it can't. It's actually referring to Bikurim. The pasuk says, "Sucha lecha b'sharecha ma'aser degancha v'siroshcha v'yitzarecha b'choros b'karcha v'tzunecha chol nidarecha asher tidar unidvaisecha." This begins talking about Meiser. It says you cannot eat it anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, only in Yerushalayim, and then it ends off with Truma Siyodecha. The same thing applies to Truma. Now, this halach we know is not true by Truma. Truma does not have to be eaten in Yerushalayim. So the Gemara says Truma Siyodecha here refers to Bikurim, and it's listed together with Meiser. So Truma and Bikurim and Meiser there have a hekesh. They are connected. Now, by Meiser, it says Mefurish in Vidui. Meiser said it's also for an onain to eat. We learn from there that through the connection to Bikurim, which is referred to here as Truma, that the same Isser applies to Truma. That's the Tanna Kama's opinion, that Bikurim, that is, what it says Truma Siyadecha, it's referring to Bikurim. That Bikurim is Asr for an onain to eat. Now Reb Shimon disagrees. Reb Shimon says the Torah calls it Truma, and the reason it's called Truma is to separate it from Meiser and to show that it has halacha like Truma, and that it's mutter for an onain to eat, just like Truma is a mutter for an onain to eat. Now, this same hekesh helps us for the next halacha, which is the chi of beer. Tanna Kama says you learn the chi of beer from Meiser to Bikurim through the same hekesh, the same connection, and Reb Shimon says the hekesh does not exist, and therefore you do not learn that chi of Meiser from there. Now, the next halacha the Gemara wants to know is, how do you know that it's usher to be burned betuma? You cannot use it for burning when they are tamei. And also the halacha that one who eats them betuma while they are tamei gets malchus. So the Gemara quotes a brisa where Reb Shimon spells out these halachas. Some machlokes about these halachas, but Reb Shimon is the one who spells them out. Reb Shimon says the pasuk says in Vidu Maisus lo be'arti mimenu bitamei. I did not burn them in a tumah, whether I'm tamei or they're tamei. I didn't burn them. Now the Reb Shimon continues and he says, that's what you say in Vidu Maisus. So I know that it's asur, but I don't know where it says the isur. Where does it say that it's asur? I don't know. The Gemara interrupts him. The Gemara says, "What do you mean you don't know?" It says specifically. It says, "Nefesh asher tiga ba v'tama ada arav v'yachol min hakadashim kiyim rachatz b'sar b'mayim." It says explicitly that it's asur. The Gemara says, "No. It says that it's asur to eat them b'tumas haguf." That's talking about when you are tamei. Well, my question is, how do you know when they are tamei that's asur? So Reb Shimon continues. He answers the question. He says because it says b'sharecha teichalenu atamei v'tahar yachdav. By psule bikur, by bechor that gets a mum. So in the description of a bechor that gets a mum, the Torah says you're allowed to eat it betuma. It says you're allowed to eat it like a tzvi, like a deer, where there's no isser. You can eat it betuma, even if they are tamei, even if you're eating together with a tamei individual, eating tamei things, you can eat it betamei. The word b'sharecha is used. And as well, here in this pasuk it says lo sucha lecha b'sharecha. It also says the word b'sharecha. So it's saying what was permitted for a bechor puzzle, a bechor with a mum, to eat bituma, that is forbidden for you. That b'sharecha that you're allowed to do with a bechor, to eat it when it is tamei. Here lo sucha lecha b'sharecha. You can't do that b'sharecha. You can't eat that tumah situation. That's where we see that it is asur for you to eat it when it is tamei. Now, the Gemara spells that out, continuing the brisa and describing the rest of the drasha. Now the Gemara goes to the next halacha. The Gemara wants to know, how do you know, as far as truma goes, that there is no isser to burn it when a tamei? We had said that it is asur to burn meiser and bikurim when they are tamei. It's asur to use it as firewood or as burning oil. The Gemara says, how do you know that that does not apply to truma? So the Gemara says, because in the pasuk of vidu meiser we say le bi'arti mimenu b'tamei, I did not burn it when it was tamei, but there's something else that I could burn when it's tamei. What's that something else? That must be truma. The Gemara says, how do you know it's truma? Maybe it's talking about kodesh. Maybe it's talking about oil that's used for carbon mincha. So the Gemara says, no, it's kal v'chomer. If you're not allowed to burn meiser when it's tamei, certainly you're not allowed to burn carbon mincha oil just because it's tamei. The issue of burning betuma means that it's forbidden to use it for your private use when it's tahar. The question is, when it becomes tamei, am I allowed to use it for my private use now? And what we're learning here is that you're not allowed to. Explicitly by Meiser it says you're not allowed to, and we're learning that Truma you're also not allowed to. So Gemara says maybe you learn to karbonos, to carbon mincha oil. Gemara says no, that's very chomer. It's carbon mincha oil. It's kachim is a much higher level. Certainly it has to be that's asur. You can't tell me that that's what's permitted. So the Gemara says, well, guess what? Truma is also more chomer than Meiser. So you should also make a kal v'chomer from Meiser. Just like Meiser is asur to burn for your benefit when it's tamei, Truma should also be asur. How could you say that it's mutter? Someone says, what do you mean? I said I have a limud. It says there'll be arti mimenu b'tamei. Only Meiser is asur, but something else is permitted. So that's talking about Truma. So Gemara says, okay, so then if you're using your limud of mimenu, something else, so back to my question, right? Your kal v'chomer is being contradicted by your limud. So one of these two, which you could make a kal v'chomer and say that it's asur, is not asur, because the pasuk of mimenu says that something's permitted. So how do you know which one it is? Maybe it's karbanos, maybe it's carbon mincha oil. How do you know that it's truma that's permitted? So Gemara says, listen, if I have to choose between one of the two that should be permitted, I'm going to choose the lighter one. The stricter one should be asur, and the lighter one should be mutter. And carbon is obviously the stricter of the two between carbon and truma. And the reason is because it's stricter in a number of halachos. The Gemara says there is a mnemonic about the 6 halachos. It's called a pankachas, peinun kuf ayin chaf samach. They are pigul. Carbonos have the halacha of pigul. No, so they can't be left over. Carbon, they have the special kedusha of karbonos, they are aser bahana. Me'ila, there is an isser to use them. Kares, one who uses them improperly gets kares. And samach is aser, as in aser la'onein, and onein is not allowed to eat them. So you see that carbon is stricter in these 6 ways. So the Gemara says truma is its own strictness. It has 4 ways in which it is stricter than karbonos. Somebody who eats truma is chayv misa. Somebody who eats truma by accident has to pay chomesh. Truma cannot be redeemed. Kamaras can be redeemed. The kedusha can be transferred. Truma is also to zarim. Karbonos are often eaten by Yisraelim. So you got 4 chumras here. So the Gemara says, well, it's 6 against 4, so therefore you go with the stricter one. And another way to show that karbonos are actually the stricter of the 2 is you just compare the punishment. Somebody who violates the halacha, for karbonos he gets kares, and for truma he only gets misum b'nei shemayim. So there you have head-to-head. Kares is the stricter punishment of the 2, and therefore karbonos is stricter. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the next halacha which we have seen. We mentioned, wasn't in the brisa, but we mentioned, is that somebody who eats tamei truma does not get malchus. So the Gemara says it doesn't get malchus, but the implication is that it is aser. How do you know that it is aser? What is the source for that? So the Gemara says, because we say bisharecha toichalenu, you're allowed to eat it bisharecha. That's talking about carbon bechor, which becomes a balmum. So it's only techalenu, it's only that you're allowed to eat betuma, but it's not something else. And the other thing that you're not allowed to betuma is truma. Now, this is actually not a lav, it's an asay, because it says techalenu, you should eat it, and we learn only it, but not something else. So it's what we call a lav haba machal asay. You learn from this asay that something else is a lav, and it's a rule, a lav haba machal asay is an asay, but it is still aser. Now the Gemara just wants to mention, we were started off this whole conversation looking for a ton of shir in the brisa, looking for something else that's left out of the brisa. The Gemara says there are 2 other halachas that are left out of the brisa, listing the differences between meiser versus truma and bikurim, and that is that truma and bikurim exist every year. Meiser sheni only exists on year 1, 2, and on year 4 and 5 of the Shemitah cycle. And Meiser Sheni can be redeemed, while Truma and Bikurim are not redeemable. So those 2 things were left off the list, and therefore there's another ton of a shear. And you don't have a proof then that an Oro is not allowed to eat from Meiser just because it was left off the list. And we remain with the question we started with: what is the halacha about an Oro as far as Meiser goes?